Welcome, everybody. My name is Małgorzata Bakalarz-Diverge. I am a director of academic programs here at the Center for Jewish History. Together with the Scholars Working Group, Hear They Cry, Understanding Jewish Orphan Experience, I'm very happy to welcome you all today to our virtual space. Center for Jewish History is a home for archival collections of 5 partner institutions: YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, Leo Baeck Institute, American Jewish Historical Society, Yeshiva University Museum, and American Sephardi Federation. Together, these collections create the second largest archive of the Jewish experience in the world. We aspire to ensure that the center is also an intellectual home for exchanges of ideas, scholarship, creative practice, inspired and informed by these archival collections. We seek to support scholarship in various ways, by hosting seminars and conferences, providing fellowships and mentoring, and also by facilitating transdisciplinary scholars working groups, creating space for their intellectual experiments and exchanges. Today marks the end of the first year of gatherings of one of these scholars working groups that has been exploring the topic of Jewish orphan experience. And I'm thrilled to introduce Dr. Susan Jakobowicz, one of the group's leaders, who is going to introduce our today's speaker, Dr. Beth Cohen, and who is going to tell us a little bit more about the group. Susan, stage is yours.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. We've had this remarkable opportunity to work as co-directors. I want to thank Dr. Amy Traver, who's the co-director of the Scholars Working Group with me. We've had this extraordinary opportunity to do this interdisciplinary work this year. I want to thank the participants too. We've had people from the beginning who've been coming in remotely using a platform like this. Now we're all coming in remotely, but it's given us this opportunity to kind of think outside the box, to sort of think in an interdisciplinary way, to hear from archivists and from experts that the center has provided access to, and to use the amazing facilities for research and the archival collections at the center. So it's really been a special experience, and I'm very grateful to have been able to be part of it. I'm an English professor myself. And so, and Dr. Traver is in sociology. And so we've been able to sort of, together bring this sort of interdisciplinary group together. I want to thank Dr. Bakalarz-Diverge because she's been so helpful and such a big part of our inspiration as we've been doing this work. I want to thank the Center for Jewish History. I mentioned Dr. Traver. She's done just such an amazing job putting our sessions together this year and organizing the speakers that we've had a chance to hear from. And the members of our Scholars Working Group. Thank you so much for being a part of this. And I want to welcome all the guests who are joining us as well. We're really glad to have you with us. We have a really special guest who's going to be speaking today, Dr. Beth Cohen. I met her at a conference in it's 2009 now, but her presentation was so amazing that I remembered it, and I wanted to hear more about her work and what she was doing now, and ask her to address our group. I'll tell you a little bit about her background. She received her PhD in Holocaust history from Clark University. She has a master's degree in developmental psychology from Harvard University. Her first book is called Case Closed: Holocaust Survivors in Postwar America, which I highly recommend. It's a really wonderful work. It analyzes the reception of adult survivors by the American Jewish community. It's actually, no, that's not correct. It's the reception of the orphans as they were received, I believe, around, yeah? It focuses more on adults?
Well, adults, yes, yeah.
In your presentation, I was thinking of that was really looking at the individual cases of orphans that got me really, really interested in this work. So her recent book, Child Survivors of the Holocaust, The Youngest Remnant and the American Experience, was published in 2018. I'm still waiting for my copy. It investigates child survivors and their complex identity as survivors, children, and Americans. I think we'll be hearing more about that today. Her work on the post-war experience of survivors can also be found in some edited collections that we can provide people with the full, information on the links, but one is entitled Children in the Holocaust and Its Aftermath. Another is We Are Here, New Approaches to Displaced Persons in Germany. And a collection entitled After the Holocaust, Challenging the Myth of Silence And then there are some other publications as well. She's a lecturer at California State University, Northridge, California, in history and Jewish studies. Currently, she is researching the intersection of gender and grief in Holocaust survivors, and she's going to tell us more about her research now.
Before this happens, though,
Yeah.
I have to be the maintenance person and have to explain our attendees that you will be able, and you're actually welcome to ask your questions via chat or via Q&A. Actually, let's uniform it and make it a Q&A version. Each of you has it on the bottom of your screen. So please, during or right after the lecture, please type your questions. And after the lecture is over, I will be reading them to Dr. Cohen. So that would be the way for us to contact and connect.
Great.
Dr. Cohen, without further ado, the stage is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Susan, for that very generous introduction and for inviting me to present as part of the Scholars Working Group, and to the Center for Jewish History for hosting this, and in particular to Dr. Małgorzata Balakaz-Diverge for her help in organizing this program. And I want to thank all of you in the audience for zooming in, and if there are any survivors in the audience, I want to express my appreciation. Your stories are really what animate and give life to my work. For some time, I've been collecting images of child survivors that I found in the post-war US media. I've been intrigued by what I saw in these photographs that had captured children as they reached American shores. I found photograph after photograph of youngsters arriving and embraced by families. The heartwarming photos provided very American depictions to a public eager for happy endings to the war and promising beginnings for these innocent victims of genocide. But the images also pushed me to ask what happened to the children in the days after the pictures were taken. What did the pictures omit? How did they come to American families, and what were the children's perceptions of new family constellations and dynamics? To pursue these and other questions, I searched for, located, and interviewed the children in the photographs. I also drew from testimony collections in the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and the USC Shoah Archive. What I discovered, and what I'll share with you today, is that these photos are powerful entrance points through which I could explore the early experiences of child survivors who came to the U.S. I soon realized, of course, that there's no one monolithic or typical post-war experience for children. Age, gender, family connections, not to mention U.S. quotas, all had an impact. Critically, too, were children's wartime paths. Yet there are patterns that emerge and ripple through testimonies and archival documents that transcend disparate individual accounts. The images I'll show you reflect unique stories, but are also emblematic of the larger narrative of orphan child survivors' early post-war experiences. Before we look at the images, I want to briefly address 4 points that provide context for my talk. First of all, how do I define a child survivor? Here I turn to child survivor organizations who put the age limit as those who were 17 years old in 1945. And while not absolute or perfect, it's generally the standard I use. In addition, although the term child survivor originated in the 1980s, it's not contemporary to the early period after World War II. I use it to describe European Jewish children in the early post-war era. Second, how many orphans came to America? Exact figures of those who immigrated to the United States are not known. What we do know is that President Truman issued a directive in December of 1945 that allowed some 39,000 DPs into the United States and stipulated that preference would be given to 1,000 orphans, particularly those who had relatives to sponsor them. The DP Act of 1948 brought some 80,000 Jewish survivors into the U.S., including 5,000 orphans. Many more child survivors came with families, either parents, step-parents, or with relatives, or in quasi-families, groups formed during or after the war but weren't related. And of course, these groups did include orphans. So we estimate between 3,000 to 5,000 orphans came to the United States. 3, who managed their care? The impending arrival of war orphans in 1946 reactivated the wartime European Jewish Children's Aid, the EJCA, formerly the German Jewish Children's Aid, and propelled it into the post-war arena as the preeminent national agency that supervised children's resettlement around the United States. The EJCA worked with both the non-sectarian United States Committee for the Care of European Children Abroad and directly with local U.S. Jewish agencies. USCOM designated 164 social service agencies around the country that were qualified to work with incoming children. 4, what are my sources? The semi-annual reports that local agencies were required to submit to the EJCA are valuable windows into post-war treatment of child survivors by both social workers and foster families. I also drew from additional materials such as contemporary social work journals, case files, studies of Jewish war orphans, interviews, and oral testimonies, as I mentioned. Okay, now the images and the stories behind them. The early post-war reports on surviving children were dire. As knowledge came to light that 1.5 million Jewish European children had been murdered and a mere 150,000 had survived, American Jews responded immediately. One of the first steps U.S. Jewish organizations took was to run fundraising campaigns to create and finance children's homes in Europe for surviving youth. A popular vehicle was the Adoptive Child program, which asked individuals or synagogues, trade unions, sisterhoods to pledge $1 a day for a year to support a child in an orphanage in countries including France, Belgium, Poland, and Netherlands, and Sweden. And here's a picture of an example of a child. This is Gaston Friedman in France, who was quote unquote adopted by Mayor O'Dwyer in New York. Images of war orphans like Gaston Friedman, who lived in a children's home, soon appeared regularly in the post-war press. Even though intention was fundraising, these campaigns sent a mixed message. They generated awareness of orphans, which raised money, at the same time provoked interest in actual adoption. As a result, couples started writing to agencies expressing their desire to bring a war orphan into their home. Quote, "My wife and I wish to adopt 2 refugee children," stated one man. "We desire a boy of 3 to 5 years of age and a girl between 2 to 4. Similarly, quote, "We are writing to you in regards to adopting a baby," one woman began, then declared, "My husband and I have decided on a girl. If not a boy, will be loved just as dearly. We want a baby. The younger, the better, in order to turn our cherished dream into a reality." Few Americans understood that most child survivors were neither orphans nor very young, nor were most prospective parents candidates to adopt, as the Truman Directive had indicated that the 1,000 eligible orphans would go first and foremost to their relatives. Next slide, please, slide 3. Such was the case with Ruth and Lea Kay, 13 and 12 years old respectively, whose arrival was captured in the New York Daily News in their grandfather's embrace. The girls had lived passing as Christians together in multiple children's hiding places in France during the war and placed in a children's home after the war ended. Their grandfather in the picture had managed to immigrate from Germany to New York in 1938. He saw the girls' names on a list of orphans in France and arranged to sponsor them. He met the girls at the dock and immediately deposited them with an aunt and uncle. He died suddenly several months later, never having seen his granddaughters again. Lea, one of the girls, described her reception by her relatives as anything but warm. Their aunt immediately shaved their heads, locked the refrigerator, did not permit them to go into the living room or to speak French with each other because she feared the girls were talking about her. Moreover, their cousin, who was around their age, keenly resented their presence. Lea felt she had, quote, "gone from one hell to another." After 2 grim years, the aunt contacted the Jewish organization which had been providing the family with a stipend for the girls' care, which Lea believes was the family's main motivation for taking them, and declared she no longer wanted the sisters. The girls asked the agency to send them to Texas, because they reasoned it had both an aura of adventure and was a significant distance from New York. They were soon delivered to the Wolf Memorial Home in Houston, where they encountered 3 orphan survivors. The sisters were then separated and each sent to separate Jewish foster homes under the supervision of the local Jewish Family and Children's Services. Lea cared for the family's 3 children during the day and went to high school at night. After graduating, she married and had 4 children, then divorced and remarried. She noted in her interview that she takes great pleasure in her family, including her second husband, but at times laments leaving France for the United States. Siblings Mary and Alfred Friedman also benefited from the Truman Directive. They arrived in 1947, still in the first wave of orphans under the relative sponsorship. Mary was born in 1936. I'm going to focus on Mary because I was able to interview her, but her brother Freddie had already passed away. After the country, Belgium, was occupied by the Nazis, Mary's mother brought her to a convent school in 1941. She was around 5 and left her there. It turned out to be a grim and punitive institution for wayward girls. By the war's end, her mother and father were presumed dead, but a sibling of her mother had survived and knew where Alfred and Mary were hiding. Several other siblings had immigrated to the United States decades earlier. In 1947, the pair were sent to these relatives in Illinois. Slide 4, please. The pair's arrival was announced in the Decatur Review, War Orphans Find Home. The article reported Dr. and Mrs. Schlosser, the children's maternal uncle, and his wife had gone to great lengths to arrange to bring Mary and her brother to the United States. They were eager to take the pair into, quote, their homes and lives. The Schlossers, already parents of a 2-year-old son, emphasized their generous determination to give Mary and Alfred every opportunity they possibly could for successful lives. They also prepared by brushing up on their French in order to better communicate with the siblings. It sounded promising. Nearly 70 years later, however, Mary reflected on her beginnings as so vastly different from the encouraging newspaper account. Though the Schlossers professed commitment to their niece and nephew, from Mary's perspective, it fell short. Quote, my aunt didn't have the time, nor did my uncle. Perhaps they didn't have the desire, she suggested. Less than a year after the Decatur Review pronounced the girl's, quote, dream come true, the Schlossers shipped Mary and Alfred to her maternal aunt and uncle in Detroit. Trying to understand her relative's abrupt turnaround, she explained, quote, I was quite feisty and in school disruptive. She hoped the second family would give her the attention she craved, but they were working people and did not have the time or energy to invest in their niece. Quote, basically I was alone, and even though I had people, I didn't feel accepted, which she added was a pattern throughout my life until I became an older adult. Before long, Mary was living in a group foster home. From there, a Jewish family took her in so that Mary believed she could be their housekeeper and nanny. By the time she graduated from high school, 7 years after her heralded arrival in Illinois, she had lived in 4 different places, adopted by none. Nobody, Mary states emphatically, wanted an orphan. Mary struggled throughout her life. However, she enjoyed professional success. She became a psychiatric nurse, married later in life, and recently published a memoir. She hopes it will help others like herself who have wrestled with depression. Lea, Ruth, and Mary's early experience in families were not unique. In a report from Du Portnoy, an EJCA representative, she observed between 1/3 to 1/2 of initial placements did not last. And, quote, with these failures, the youngsters have lost resources for emotional as well as financial support. One social worker, E. Hirsch, who studied 316 children that came to the U.S. after the Truman Directive, wrote in 1949 that despite best efforts on all sides, the results were often a complete failure. Some professionals who worked directly with the newcomers quickly recognized the complications that arose between the youngsters and their American relatives and tried to take preemptive measures. For example, by 1948, Hilda Meyerowitz, another EJCA field representative, was acutely aware of the challenges embedded in these new relationships. When a colleague was ready to start a home study of a prospective foster family interested in 2 siblings, her answer was direct, quote, in all our planning for minor children, she advised, we want to be sure to help people realize that it is not only the question of bringing a child to this country, but they have to realize what it means to raise a child that has such a different background, different experience, and may need a great deal of help and a long time to adjust to a new setting. The necessary patience, however, eluded many new foster and adoptive parents. Despite the judicious suggestions, as the files from the European Jewish Children's Aid make stunningly clear, these recommendations were hard to implement. The EJCA required a complete home study of all potential foster families, but the extent that the professionals themselves participated or intervened varied depending on numerous factors, including the caseload, the social work's training, and parents' acceptance of agency involvement. Particularly in cases where relatives believed they knew best, the agencies were often powerless because of familial roadblocks that undermined their efforts. Even when a seemingly best attempt was made, insurmountable problems arose. Yet at times, children themselves showed remarkable agency, as we'll see. Lea Kay's experiences with family both confirm the Friedman and Krell siblings, but also illustrate another response. Born in 1938, by the time she was 7, Lea had lived in the Lubov ghetto, a bunker with a Polish rescuer, and in a DP camp. She was also an orphan. Her surviving grandfather heard that the U.S. was accepting orphans and arranged for her to go to relatives in New York. Have the next slide, slide 5, please. Here's an image of the SS General Bundy that brought 802 newcomers to Boston, and Lea was among them, waving one of those flags. She remembers this November day clearly, receiving an American flag and being asked to pose for a group picture. She also recollects, despite the picture's caption, during that time, quote, "I was very, very sad." From the start, her sponsor and aunt and uncle made it clear she was not welcome. Her aunt's first gesture to Lea was to cut her hair, since the woman was convinced erroneously that the child had lice and would pass it on to their daughter, who was about Lea's age. Lea recollects that her aunt promised to show her a photograph of her beloved grandfather if she behaved herself. Though she recalls trying very hard, she never did see her grandfather's picture. After some months, a social worker from a Jewish agency paid family a visit. Her aunt warned her niece to tell the woman how happy she was. Lea did so the first time, but by the social worker's second visit, Lea courageously decided to tell the truth, reported she hated the home, that her aunt left her meals for Lea outside of her bedroom on the floor, that she had been dearly mistreated. Soon the social worker returned and told her, quote, "We're going to send you to the country where you'll see chickens and cows and other children." Before long, Lea was en route to Cleveland and the Belfair Jewish Home for Problem Children. She spent the next 7 years there. Let's just say briefly that the Belfair Home in Cleveland was quite a well-known Jewish orphanage, and it had been established after the Civil War in 1868 for orphans, for children orphaned by the Civil War. Actually, for Lea, being sent to the Belfair Home was a fortuitous turn of events. According to her, the institution employed cutting-edge treatments like art and music therapy, as well as psychoanalysis. After Lea refused to speak to a series of social workers, she was referred to a psychoanalyst. The analyst told her, quote, "I cannot be your mother, but I can be like a favorite aunt." The relationship and the woman's unswerving presence and commitment to Lea were critical to the child's emotional development. But Lea's displacement continued. She spent time with 2 foster families. The first one lasted 6 months and was not a good fit. Finally, at the age of 14, she went to a family that wanted to adopt her. Lea was reluctant, fearful of forging a connection only to lose it. Eventually, she agreed. She became Julie, the daughter of Fred and Lea Kay, and described her new parents as wonderful. Although Julie spent a significant part of her childhood in an institution and never saw the alleged chicken and cows, she is not bitter about it. On the contrary, she believes it saved her. Irene G. is somewhat atypical example for several reasons, as we'll see. She was brought to New York in 1947 by Rescue Children, an Orthodox organization that was particularly active in the post-war effort to recover Jewish children from Gentile environments and place them in Jewish settings. While two rescue children members were searching in Poland, they received a tip about a Jewish child living with a Gentile woman. That was Irene. Irene was born in Czechoslovakia in 1937. She and her family were deported to Auschwitz, where she and her twin brother, Rene, were selected for Mengel's horrific experiments. At the end of the war, a young Polish woman who lived in Oswiecim came into the camp and plucked her out. She brought Irene to her farm, where Irene was soon helping out with farm chores. After a few months, some men, whom she subsequently learned were part of rescued children, removed her and placed her in a Jewish orphanage in Poland. After several additional moves, she was brought to Fourblain, one of rescued children's orphanages in France. Irene's post-war testimony provides her recollections of Fourblain as an 8-year-old child. Quote, I would listen as many of the children related their tales of what happened to them and how they got to be here, and many of them were hidden by non-Jewish families. I was the only child with a number, the only child from a concentration camp. So when I heard all the stories that were being told, I said, they're never going to believe where I was, and I never spoke about it. Nobody asked me, but I was crying the whole time inside. I was so lonely. I just desperately wanted somebody to hug me, just to hug me, and I didn't know how to go about getting somebody to do that. Irene developed a close relationship with an older teenager, Miriam, who became, in her words, a surrogate mother. Miriam was planning to go to Palestine on Youth Aliyah, and Irene wanted to go with her. Rescue children, however, had other plans. One day she was informed she was going to America. She recalled, I didn't want to go to America. I wanted to go with Miriam. She was the only person I felt close to. This very nice gentleman said to me, well, it will only be for a little bit and we'll bring you right back. I believed him. Soon Irene and another little boy, orphan boy, were en route to America. Once in New York, she remembers a lot of commotion. As the next slide, please. The children were taken on whirlwind shopping trips, all documented in the press. There were others, but here's one that was captured in a photo essay in Life magazine entitled Orphans Closed. Irene learned later that the two children were chosen by rescue children to raise money. She remarked, I guess we were quite successful because they did raise quite a bit of money for the war orphans. But I only wanted to go back and be with Miriam and go to Israel, and all these things, the teddy bears, the dolls, the chocolate, didn't mean anything to me. When it came time to ask, when am I going back, this very nice gentleman said to me, we're not sending you back. On reflection, Irene expresses ambivalence. On the one hand, she felt she was exploited. On the other, she believes rescue children really didn't know any better. Within weeks, Irene was sent to spend a weekend with a family who wanted to adopt her. This came to naught. The head of the household communicated that Irene was too quiet for them, that no, they did not wish to adopt her. Irene wasn't disappointed, however. She had grown attached to the rabbi and his wife who were hosting her and were hoping they would keep her. However, the rabbi again told her no, she was going to another home. Irene recalls the drive there and being left with the family against her will. Fortunately, the stay with the new family turned out differently than the previous one. In Irene's words, her mother stood by her, adding, it was a blessing in disguise. Providentially, too, the Life magazine article found its way to a doctor in Czechoslovakia, where unbeknownst to Irene, her surviving twin Renee was living. Somehow the connection was made. Irene's new family went to great lengths to bring Renee to America and adopt him as well. At the age of 12, the twins were reunited after a separation of 5 years. Irene had warm feelings towards the family who adopted her, and unlike most of the others I mentioned, she was officially adopted. Irene graduated valedictorian of her high school class and went to college. She also married and raised a family. Later in life, she became an accomplished calligrapher, in part, she admits, to chase away persistent memories of Auschwitz. She also suffered from MS, which she believes was brought on by Mengel's experiments she suffered through. The final example I'll mention now, in the summer of 1946, the Jewish Family and Children's Services of Boston created a special New Americans unit at Camp Kingswood, an existing Jewish summer camp in Maine. The brainchild of Jewish Family Children's Service Director Beatrice Carter, the program was specifically for child survivors in Boston who had problematic family placements, as well as those who need remedial preparation for integration into a special education or particular educational setting. All aspects of this camp's life were determined by the children's needs. The camp, noted Beatrice Glantz, a social worker who studied the program, quote, became a place where the children could be helped in working through their emotional tensions. Nowhere was this more evident than when Beatrice Carter urged the teens to produce a play about their wartime experiences. Final slide, please. This photo is from the literary magazine that was entirely produced by the campers. And it was a photo of the play that the campers produced and acted in. Barbara S., a 16-year-old Auschwitz survivor, clearly remembers the play and her role. She's both in the top and the bottom photograph on the far right, the girl with the dark hair and the white blouse on. She played a mother preparing for the Sabbath with her children, just as German soldiers arrived in their town. Fortunately, when the summer was over, support for the children continued. Because of its success and because the orphans' placements were precarious, Mrs. Carter set up 3 residential homes in Boston. Descriptions of the Bradshaw House, one of these group homes, depict a therapeutic milieu. Besides bedrooms, there was a living room for socializing, a recreational area complete with a workshop, and a quiet room for individualized academic tutoring. If the public high school was not a good fit, the staff looked for other opportunities for the teens, including boarding schools for troubled adolescents. One social worker characterized the JF&CS program as one that put every means at its disposal to serve the individual needs of the group and was, quote, unusually comprehensive in its consideration of displaced children's welfare. But how did the children themselves feel? Barbara S. recalls Bradshaw House warmly. Quote, it was like a family, she states. Even though Carter was not Jewish and most of the teens were not religious, Carter still insisted on keeping the homes kosher so that the survivors could maintain a connection to their tradition. Barbara also recalls she received a clothing allowance. As an adult, she marvels at the fact that although she made some very impractical purchases, the agencies allowed her autonomy. Quote, Mrs. Carter never criticized me and never told me how to spend the money. In addition, Carter supported Barbara through 2 foster placements until the girl finished high school. Mrs. Carter, she affirmed, understood her and, quote, really knew how to listen. Robert B., another child survivor in the program, echoed these sentiments. He remembered, quote, Mrs. Carter frequently expressed her view that each one of us had a nugget of gold hidden inside, and it was the task of the staff at JF&CS to dig for that nugget, bring it to the surface, and let it grow and glow. Certainly, this belief in the inherent goodness of the children was a sharp contrast to so many others' memories of family and institutional placement. In conclusion, although news accounts promised bright futures for war orphans who came to this country, orphan survivors' beginnings in the United States were enormously complicated. While many relatives initially opened their homes and Jewish organizations continued the assistance that began in Europe, this phase in the children's lives was often dismal. Records as well as testimonies capture mutual disappointments and rejection, and at times abuse at the hands of those who had taken them into their homes. Why? Were the demands of wounded children too much? Was it because their recent traumas were simply, as one orphan noted, quote, impossible to understand? Did their U.S. kin's obligation to their dead relatives carry so little depth that when confronted with challenges posed by the newcomers, their good intentions unraveled? At least one agency found a creative way to truly help the children, showing that a combination of compassion, sincere interest, activism, and caring made all the difference in orphans' lives. And there were relatives and those without a familial connection who understood and supported their charges unconditionally. These children felt welcomed and loved, but more often adults' interests waned, disappeared, or hardened into antipathy, which not only made a travesty of the hopeful beginning showcased in the press, but also propelled children on yet another series of displacements that did not end in America. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to start by addressing the complaints of some of you. I am terribly sorry about the issues with the quality of sound that you may had. Please know that this lecture is recorded and that we are going to post it on our YouTube channel as well. So for those of you who didn't have a chance to listen to it for the entire time, or did have some issues on their end, I hope that you will be able to watch it again. We do have questions. One question that we have, the first question that we have is, was it common for children to be moved from home to home? And was it common for child survivors to get sick later in life?
Yes, it was very common. As I noted towards the beginning of my talk, perhaps as many as 1/2 of placements didn't work out initially, so children were often moved. And as I mentioned in several of my examples, the example of the Lea and Ruth Kay, the example of Lea Kay, the example of Mary F., all of those children were moved, if not once, then several times. So yes, that was very, very common, and sometimes that happened immediately, or even like Irene, who was eventually adopted, she went just for a brief time for a weekend to a family, and they decided after the weekend that they didn't want to keep her, so she was sent elsewhere. And I want to remind people that these displacements, these moving around in the United States, was followed by numerous displacements in Europe, often in multiple hiding places, ghettos, camps. So by the time the children were teens, they had already lived through many, many displacements in their brief lives, not to mention traumas, traumatic experiences. And as far as illness is concerned, or is the question about physical illness or mental illness?
We will wait for Julia, who asked that question, to clarify. So let's keep the question about illness until it gets clarified. I have another one. Dr. Cohen, the impression you give is that most adoption failed. Is that generally correct?
The truth is, I discovered when I went into this research thinking that children had been adopted. And I discovered that, in fact, the initial group of 1,000 orphans that came were destined to go to relatives. And in many, many cases, the relatives had absolutely no intention of adopting the children, and they ended up being foster children. So, so in the first instance, many of these cases many of the children were not adopted. The ones that were adopted, like Julie, who was eventually adopted when she was 14, claimed her family was wonderful. And Irene, who was somewhat unusual because of the way she came, kind of through the back door, came to adoption, she also had positive memories about her family. So I don't want to say that all of the adoptions were a failure, but I think we have to take a very nuanced look at what the adoption process was like and how the children experienced it. And in many instances, it wasn't necessarily all good or all bad. Often children look back and realize that they were suffering from depression and post-traumatic stress syndrome after the war, and they had no outlet for expressing it. So they were extremely sad during their childhood, even though they had been adopted into a family. So I think it's not really a question of successful or not successful, or yes or no, but we have to take, there are a lot of, it's not black and white, there are a lot of grays in the issue of adoption.
Mm-hmm. So Julia clarified that she meant both mental and physical health.
I would say that in terms of the mental health, I believe that a lot of child survivors, first of all, my research on child survivors in general suggests that the children never really get over their memories, and they have scars throughout their lives. So I think that many struggle with depression, with feelings of displacement, but I don't want to make a blanket statement about that, because many also went on to lead, very fulfilled lives, to marry, to have families, to have careers, to be able to, to have, full lives. And yet, I think their lives were always colored by what they experienced as children. I'm not sure about the physical health aspect. I have heard that older survivors are prone to certain disease, but I have not really studied that fully with child survivors.
The next question, and I promise I will read all the questions. To those of you who are repeating your questions, I see them, I just need to read them in order. Many adult survivors arrived in the US. Did they replace their children by adopting child survivors? Replace their children by adopting child survivors?
I don't think that happened in the United States. I know of some instances where individuals in Europe in BP camps met orphans and decided to take them under their wing. What I didn't mention was that even though the images that the post-war press gave were war orphans, the majority of child survivors were not orphans. We think somewhere between 25 to 30% were orphans, and the others, the majority had one surviving parent, and a fewer number, of course, had two surviving parents. So the adult survivors often married quickly in DP camps and started another family. Sometimes they discovered later that they had a surviving child who they didn't know had survived in hiding. But in getting back to your question about if adult survivors adopted child survivors, I don't think that was a widespread phenomenon, no.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Is it a myth of historical inaccuracy that the American Jewish community believes that they welcomed the orphans?
I think that that's again a complicated question. I think that the media promoted the idea that orphans were being welcomed, but I think that the interest in orphans very quickly, faded by the early 50s and so on. You very rarely saw images. So I don't think there was a sense that so much about orphans. I think there was more of a sense that older survivors had been welcomed, which that I do think was a myth. But the sense that orphans were welcomed, it was promoted in the press, but I think interest very quickly faded, and it didn't really even gain enough traction, I think, to become a myth.
Okay, we have another question. I did a quick Google research on the US Holocaust Memorial Museum's Holocaust Encyclopedia website. I found twins Renee and Renate Gutmann, who lived in Prague, Czechoslovakia after their family fled from Dresden, Germany. Their photos and mini bios, along with those from other Holocaust survivors from World War II years, are included. My question, are these the twins that you mentioned in your presentation today? And thank you for a very informative presentation.
Yes, those are the same twins.
Okay.
And in fact, there has been a documentary film made about them. And yeah, I'm sorry to say that Irene passed away in the last year, which I was very sorry to learn.
Thank you. I would like to thank Dr. Cohen for this interesting presentation. Could you please talk a little bit more about the orphans' decision to stay silent about their wartime experiences during the early post-war period? You mentioned that there were times when their new families were not interested in the children's wartime experiences. Were there any other factors that played a role in the orphans' silence?
I think that was true not just for orphans, but for child survivors in general. And I think part of the reason was that they weren't really considered survivors, even by older Holocaust survivors. You know, many children survived because they were hidden in non-Jewish environments. So adults often assumed that they were rescued, which they were physically, but that it was either a benign or a positive experience, which it often sometimes was, sometimes wasn't. But adults assumed that children would forget about their experiences and move on. And there were times when children tried to talk about their experiences to adults in families of when their parents had not survived and they were in foster families. And the foster parents accused them of making things up, or they would overhear people saying, my goodness, that child has such an imagination. Can you believe the things she's saying? So children learn quickly, if they tried to talk about their experiences, they tamped them down. And Dr. Robert Krell, who's a psychiatrist and a child survivor, also said that children, had learned to be silent during the war, especially those who were in hiding. And so the silence was maintained for a long time. And it was really only in the 1983 that child survivors began to be recognized and as survivors, and they started forming groups and child survivor groups and hidden children groups. And it was into the late 80s and early 90s that they started finally having an identity as child survivors.
I have to ask a follow-up question. Were there any attempts of any kind of psychological or psychiatrical research projects between that period, between after the war and the 80s? Was there anyone interested in this?
There were a few people that did some studies in DT camps of children, but they weren't, not many. But this is already getting into a later period. Dr. Judith Kestenberg, who was a psychiatrist from Poland, but had emigrated to the United States before the war, was interested in persecuted children. And she started interviewing children, and it became the first oral history project specifically of child survivors. And that collection of, I think, 1,500 interviews is now at Hebrew University in their collection, the Kestenberg Archive. But there wasn't a huge amount. There were some early studies in some, like in the Ose Journal of Adjustment of Children in the United States, and some of that material I drew from, and a few other social work journals. But beyond that, as I say, interest kind of waned like in the early 50s, and then not much really until later on in late 70s, early 80s. Yeah.
What is the memoir you mentioned earlier, written by Mary F?
No, yeah, it was. She's written. Her name is Mary Burgess, Berges, and I believe it's A Child Survivor Remembers. But it's on Amazon, and if you Google Mary Burgess, Berges, you'll find it.
Thank you. Was it difficult to track down the orphan survivors? And once you got in touch with them, were any of them reluctant to share their memories of childhood with you, or did they welcome the opportunity?
I think by and large, the people I contacted were really, really generous with their time and speaking with me. It was interesting because some of the people like Lea Kay, who's the very first image with her grandfather and her sister, she also passed away a number of years ago. She had never really spoken about that period. People were interested in her Holocaust experiences, but not what had happened to her when she came to the United States. So she was kind of puzzled by my interest. And then, but when she started talking, she was very, I think, very open, willing to talk, and, really was, I think, glad to be contacted. Some others, like Julie Kay, I contacted, she had never seen that picture of the 802 DPs in Boston with waving the flag. She remembered very clearly the day, getting a flag, having her picture taken, but she didn't realize the photograph existed. So she was, by and large, people were willing. Sometimes I think it was hard for them, very hard for them to talk about their experiences, and sometimes they're reluctant to be, because they had come through it and they were fully functioning adults, a little reluctant to acknowledge how severe their experiences had been when they came here in the family.
As a follow-up question, because it somehow connects to my own research, did you encounter this attempt of dismissing what happened after the war as something that was not as shocking or significant or dramatic? We made it, the war was over, so even though the next chapter of this displacement opened up in the US, this is not really something that we are going to pay so much attention to, because it's the Holocaust that we survived. Was there any kind of this?
Well, I felt for children, they really put a lot of importance on that period, actually.
Okay.
Because it had such an impact on their lives, but yet that the acknowledgement that it had an impact on their lives came later. So they, I think, wanted to acknowledge it, wanted to confront it, wanted to talk about it.
Very interesting, because my experience with the adults would be slightly different. Yeah. The next question, what did the adoptive family expect from the children? What did the children know about and expect from moving to America?
Generally, I think there was very little knowledge in either direction about each other. I think families would get some kind of brief report about the child, had to go through certain tests to get a visa to come to the United States. The families wanted kind of an assurance that the child was healthy, both in body and in mind. Often, if it was a relative, they knew a little bit about family. But I also want to point out that even in the case of relatives, the children had, by and large, never met these relatives. The relatives had, moved to the United States before the children had even been born. And so, sometimes the connection was very tenuous. In some cases that wasn't true, that the children remember their parents talking about these relatives. They remember letters, they remember presents, but very, very often there was really, the relatives were virtual strangers.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and the children, also knew very little. For example, Irene, was sent to a family. She didn't want to go there. She was left there against her will. And I think the sense in those days was she was, a 9-year-old child. We don't really need to explain anything to her. Here is a family that wants to adopt her, and she needs a family, and so, that's it. I remember interviewing one man who was 15 and was sent to a family in New York, and he said he was told in a children's home in France he was going to be adopted. He was going to a family. He was sent to them. That was the first communication he had with them, was when he met them in New York. So there was very, very little preparation for this. I mean, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Did social class and or economic position of the adopting families have any noticeable outcomes on the experiences of the adopted children?
I'm not sure. I think that, for example, if you look at a case like Mary, she went to a family, the Schlossers, he was a doctor, they were well off, but she moved to 4 different places, and she put herself through school. I would say not so much the adopted family, unless the child was adopted when it was younger. Most of the children kind of made it on their own. And it had less to do with the family that brought them up, more to do perhaps of their memories of their own family in Europe and some of the values that were imparted to them, or the ideas that they had about their family in Europe, even if they didn't know, and what they believed their parents would want them to do.
Mm. A quick follow-up question as I'm listening to you. Were your interviewees identifying themselves as orphans or as survivors?
They identified as child survivors, first of all. That's how we connected. And I found them through various child survival organizations, Holocaust organizations, or through, other contacts. So they generally didn't, their identity was more as a child survivor rather than an orphan, although that very quickly it came up as he or she was an orphan. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Another question. Did any of the survivors talk about the Holocaust to, for example, groups of youth in an educational context? This is particularly important as survivors are aging and fewer are around to tell their stories.
Yeah, many, including the people I mentioned. Some it's harder than others. Irene, for example, found it very, very difficult, but she would on occasion when asked. Julie does, Mary Burgess to a lesser extent, but these few cases that I mentioned, it's just a small sample of the number of people I've interviewed, and many child survivors now feel it's their obligation to speak, and I think it's important to them personally, not just because they feel like they are the last survivors and they're educating the youth, but Also because it's a way of giving some meaning to what they went through, rather than, you know, thinking that everything they went through was, you know, just a horrible traumatic experience. If they're able to talk about it and children are able to hear them and ask questions and they engage, it has a very positive effect on them as individuals.
Thank you. Another one. I found a home study that was commissioned by my father, who came over as an orphan. He had relatives in Milwaukee. The agency determined it would not be an appropriate placement, even though the family was well off financially. What was cited was that the mother, who was widowed, was struggling with her teenage sons who were dating shiksas. Did you ever encounter anything like that?
No, that's really interesting. You know, there are all kinds of things in the case files, but I don't recall ever, you know, ever coming across something like that in a placement that, you know, no. I think, you know, there were mentions of whether a family was observant or not, and on some occasions, if they knew the child was from it, particularly with rescued children, that was an Orthodox organization, it tried to place children with Orthodox families, even if the children themselves weren't necessarily from Orthodox families.
I'm looking at both of our sources and I don't see any more questions. So if anyone is typing their question, that's the last minute to do that. Because if I don't see anything and I'm not seeing anyone typing, then I guess that means that was our last question. Beth, thank you very much for today's lecture.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for having me. It was really an honor. And thanks to the audience.
To all the attendees. And as I said before, we're going to post this lecture together with little subtitles for those of you who were having hard time hearing everything. In a few days, I will be sending out an email to all of you to give you the link whenever it's available. In the meantime, I strongly recommend that you sign up to our newsletter so that you can be up to date with many more interesting intellectual encounters and exchanges. And I also hope that if you are our regulars, or if this was your first time, that you will consider supporting Center for Jewish History. You can donate in any way at any moment via our website and via our Facebook account. Thank you very, very much. Thank you very much, Beth. Thank you to Susan and the Scholars Working Group. And let's meet each other again soon.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, bye-bye.
Bye.